All right, welcome back to class. This is American Federal Government. My name is Ken Hicks. We've been talking a little bit sort of about the basics of American government. Today, our topic is going to be the founding and the Constitution. How did we get to this place? How did we become independent from our original sort of patron colonizer, the English? What factors led to the separation of the colonies from Great Britain, and what led the 13 independent colonies to adopt a brand new constitution. So the main topics we're going to talk about today is the first founding, the interests and the conflicts that led to separation from Great Britain. And then we're going to talk a little bit about the failure of the Articles of Confederation that made sort of a second founding necessary. So initially we have to talk about the whole idea behind the War of Independence. We're going to focus mainly on the politics and not so much on sort of all the history and the details. The United States emerged at a specific point in human history that made possible the creation of a nation organized around the concept of individual liberty. So first, the United States began as an English colony in the early colonial period, where the English approach to colonization granted considerable autonomy to their local, to their colonial possessions. North America acted as a sort of pressure valve for the English, which again, offering them a place for religious dissidents within the Commonwealth to go to the New World. It's important to keep in mind the Protestant Reformation probably had a more transformative effect on England than it did just about anywhere else. In going Protestant, and then just in the sheer number of kind of dissenting sects that emerged in England, there was a great deal of religious tumult in that period. So the religious communities that came to the New World were organized around democratic principles that contributed to the formation of a colonial political culture that was distinctive from English political culture and would form again the emphasis on democratic equality in the absence of sort of the feudal caste distinctions that rendered European societies so unequal. So in the 17th and 18th centuries, you additionally saw the emergence of, again, the Enlightenment, which emphasized the power of reason and science and the diminished authority of religion in secular affairs. The North American colonists produced kind of the quintessential children of the Enlightenment that would eventually lead to demands for independence from Great Britain for, again, a variety of reasons. It's important to keep in mind that the colonies, there was a population there when the colonies came. European colonization was oftentimes viewed as sort of a zero-sum game, if you will. They basically were taking land from people. The English were a little bit different in that they did not colonize militarily at first. Certainly the Spanish came primarily to conquer territories, and they ended up with very large colonial possessions, both in what is now Mexico, Central America, Latin America, and also the Philippines. The French primarily colonized sort of economically. The unique thing about both the French and the Spanish, or what was really unique about the English, where the French and the Spanish colonized primarily in a masculine sense. They were primarily sending men abroad to work on colonization. The English, again, remembering that this is acting as a pressure valve, the English colonized with families. They sent entire communities to the lands where they were colonizing. The idea of replacement theory, which again, as colonists, as more colonists showed up, the presence of Native Americans in settled regions decreased. They began pushing Native Americans off of lands where they had previously been, and that is sort of the quintessential aspect or illustration of what today we call replacement theory. So what factors really began to create, again, initially colonization began under the Stuarts, which again, those were the Catholic rulers of England. And so for, that early period, this was in the return after Elizabeth passed on and the Stuarts came back into power. They colonized again. It was sort of like colonization on the cheap. They basically said, you go over there, you form your communities, we won't ask much of you, don't expect much from us. So for much, again, up to 80 years, really, the colonies were left to their own devices. Then, of course, the British ended up fighting a war, a very long and costly war with France, which we called it the French and Indian War, but it was a global war for England. They were fighting in the Indian Ocean. They were fighting all over the place, and they were defending India from French advances. That led to a change in policy towards the colonies because the French and Indian Wars drained English coffers, and they needed to get revenue in order to, because again, they recognized that there would be future conflicts. The colonies would have to be defended. So that really, it created a lot of incentives among the British political elites of that day to basically, attach more heavy-handed policies. And so that actually created division within the colonists between the radicals, who were the frontier people who wanted to be left alone, wanted to continue that relationship, and those coastal elites, which were dependent on trade with Great Britain. So you ended up with serious controversies, really beginning in 1764, with the Parliament passing the Sugar Act, and then in 1765 you get the Stamp Act. Now, why was the Stamp Act so controversial? In simple terms, a Stamp Act, any kind of thing that requires stamping of mail is a tax on mail. Okay, when you affix a stamp to a piece of mail, that is the price of delivering that mail. The British felt like taxing sugar, taxing stamps would be a good way of deriving revenue. The colonists viewed it as a violation of this basic relationship that had emerged between the crown and the colonies. And that was, again, this idea that they were taxing communications within and between the colonies. It's important to keep in mind, during this period, a lot of the newspapers of the day were produced in the big cities, in New York, in Philadelphia, in Baltimore, in Charleston, and then those newspapers would be shipped inland, and that's how those people on the frontier got their news, albeit several weeks late. So the colonies viewed that as a change in the basic relationship, and it actually led to the creation of the Stamp Act Congress, which would be the first collective meeting of the representatives from most of the colonies. And it represented a significant shift in attitudes among the colonists, who began to form closer bonds with the other colonies. And it also had so you had kind of a bonding effect between the 13 colonies. And it also led to the formation of what became known as committees of correspondence, who were, they were basically people whose job was to publicize British policies, because the colonies began to recognize that the colonies were being treated differently by the British. The British were adopting different policies to keep the southern colonies separated from the northern colonies. They were kind of playing a divide to rule game. So as a result of the Stamp Act Congress, there was a boycott. The British recognized that the controversy was not going to go away, so they very quickly rescinded the taxes. But that really didn't end the growing alienation between the colonies and the British. You also had, again, the passage of the Tea Act. Now, the Tea Act was really antagonizing to the colonies for a number of reasons. First and foremost, The Tea Act basically gave a monopoly to the British East India Company on all the shipping of tea to the colonies. Now, keep in mind, at that time, Americans, like the English, were big tea drinkers. That was the beverage of choice. And so they felt like, first and foremost, that they were being taxed to actually drink, tea. More importantly, it also cut out very powerful merchant interests who were engaged in the tea trade, and they felt like they were cut out of the tea trade. They were being harmed economically, and that led to what became known as the Boston Tea Party. On December 16, 1773, colonists dressed as Indians stormed British ships and dumped all the tea into Boston Harbor, and they did that elsewhere as well. And that caused the British to double down. The king, who was a major investor in the British East India Company, was enraged, and he persuaded Parliament to pass what were known as the Coercive Acts, which involved basically the detachment of British ships to North America to blockade all North American ports until the cost of the Boston Tea Party had been defrayed. It also led to the quartering of British troops in private homes, which was enraging to the colonists. And this led to the first convening of the Continental Congress. And again, this is sort of the Stamp Act Congress continuing, where the English, the colonists are meeting and beginning to get an idea of what it would take to collectively act to basically resist what the British were doing. At this time, in 1773, most colonists still considered themselves to be British citizens, but they were increasingly aggrieved British citizens, okay? So you also had the reality of slavery in this period. Slavery as an institution played an important role in colonial moves toward independence. In southern colonies, you basically had a slave-based economy that was focused on agricultural export products, and among them were, again, coffee, tobacco, sugar. A little bit later, after independence, the cotton gin would make the picking of cotton a major southern agricultural product that they would then sell to England and to France to feed into their textile mills. There were religious revivals in that period that questioned the morality of slavery, but it was at that time widely accepted as an expedient, as a necessary element of colonial economies of that period, simply because working in the Deep South was, people died of exhaustion, of heat exhaustion. People die of heat exhaustion today, even with air conditioning. So the Declaration of Independence explained why the colonists wanted to break with Great Britain. You have, of course, the sweeping language of Section 1. It's famous. When in the course of human events it becomes necessary for one people to dissolve the political bands which have connected them with another, and to assume among the powers of the earth the separate and equal station to which the laws of nature and nature's God entitle them. A decent respect to the opinions of mankind requires that they should declare the causes which impel them to the separation. This is the language, of course, of Thomas Jefferson. And we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, and they are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, among them are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, that to secure these rights governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. Now, of course, you have also the domestic, the 27 grievances that were brought. If you actually read the entire Declaration of Independence, much of it was basically a list of grievances that the committees of correspondence had actually put together. Okay. And they included a number, they basically accused the British of instituting slavery among them. They accused the British of manipulating colonial legislatures. There were a lot of complaints in this list of particulars. And then you also, again, have the domestic realities of colonial life. The colonists' near universal commitment to manifest destiny was apparent even in 1776, and they believed that required the conquest of native peoples on the colony's frontier. Likewise, many colonists accepted the legitimacy of slavery, and the Declaration of Independence's author, Thomas Jefferson, owned over 600 slaves over the course of his life. So the European Enlightenment, nevertheless, kind of exerted a profound influence over the colonists, and one of the first kind of Enlightenment figures was Thomas Hobbes. Now, Hobbes was not a Democrat, but he was one of the first modern thinkers. He was actually educated at Oxford at a time when Oxford was moving away from a more religiously oriented curriculum to a more scientifically oriented curriculum. And Hobbes was widely acknowledged as a mathematical genius. Much of the book that he wrote, Leviathan, where he kind of articulated his political, his views of politics, used kind of metaphors of physics to explain what he was talking about. And he was a guy, and again, he was born in 1588, died in 1679, so he lived a very long life. He was born the year of the Spanish Armada, which tells you something. But he really conceived of the idea of sovereignty not as coming from God, but rather from emerging from a social contract. And so he talked about the idea of the state of nature. And the state of nature is an interesting philosophical device. It's an imaginative device, kind of a let's pretend kind of thing. And it says, imagine human beings without government. If there was no overarching authority to tell people what to do, how would they behave? It's an interesting philosophical device because it gives you real insight into human nature. And Hobbes's view of human nature is that people are terrible, that people are selfish, and that they are driven by the will to dominate other people. So he argued that life within the state of nature would be nasty, cruel, brutish, and short. Okay? And so for him, governments exist and people enter into a social contract in order to have stability, in order to have political and social order so that you can do the things that you need to do to live your life, so that you can farm and grow crops and make goods that soldiers won't come along and steal and burn. Okay? So he argued that the social contract would basically extend just about every power that individually we have to one person in order to give that person the majesty to govern and to compel obedience, peace, and order. Okay? So another important social contract theorist was John Locke, and Locke was he was a teenager, I think, when Hobbes died, but he basically had some more favorable assumptions about human nature. He didn't believe that we were inhuman, cruel, savage beasts. He imagined that human beings in a state of nature would naturally form communities, and that some would be, the problem was that some would be committed to taking by theft what they were unwilling to earn by labor. So for that reason, Locke believed that people left the state of nature to secure what in his day was life, liberty, and property. Okay. Likewise, so you can see where Jefferson cribbed part of the Declaration of Independence. For that reason, again, likewise he argued that should a ruler prove tyrannical or incompetent, that the people retain the right to rebel and to cast off one ruler in favor of another. And it shouldn't be surprising that Locke was a very influential advisor to one of the founders of the Whig Party, that was the guy who was called the Lord of Shaftesbury. And he was the guy that was one of the guys that was very responsible for the Glorious Revolution that led to the displacement of Charles III, I want to say, and his replacement by the House, by George I and the House of Hanover. So another important Enlightenment figure for the colonists was a French nobleman by the name of Montesquieu. And he basically promulgated the idea of the separation of powers. Montesquieu, again, was a French noble. He greatly admired the English political system, and he believed that the genius of that system was its division of power between the crown and the parliament. He reasoned that such a separation of co-equal and with intermingled powers had a tendency of checking the urge of one faction to dominate the other, cultivating an environment where the government would act in the interests of the whole rather than some narrow faction, and where in the process of governing, the impulse would be more towards compromise than towards imposition. So the first system of government that was created was the Articles of Confederation, and it emerged out of the Continental Congress. It was a government by legislature. Article 2 of the Articles of Confederation declared that each state retained its sovereignty, freedom, and independence. In other words, it remained a confederacy. Each of the 13 colonies, Georgia was a separate sovereign branch of government, separate from New York. They only acted where a consensus could be achieved among all of the 13 colonies. So each state had one vote within the within the Continental Congress. All 13 states had to agree to any amendments to the Articles of Confederation. And so as a result of that, here's something that's important to understand in politics. When you have to achieve consensus in order to do anything, the likelihood of collective action diminishes dramatically, because some people will always benefit from inaction. Okay, and so the Continental Congress had very limited powers. It could declare war, it could negotiate peace, and it could negotiate treaties and form alliances with other countries and with Native American tribes. The national government could issue a currency and could borrow money. And the national government regulated trade with the Native American tribes. However, laws had to be executed by the state governments. And to the extent that there was an American army, it was comprised solely of those state militias detached to the national government. And perhaps most importantly, the Continental Congress had no direct authority to collect taxes. Now, governments that lack taxing authority are not really governments. Okay, because they really have no capacity to actually do the things that we expect governments to do. And so unsurprisingly, over time, the colonies began to drift under the Articles of Confederation. And they were drifting in a very dangerous direction. There were increasing conflicts between the colonies over westward expansion. There were some colonies that were very aggressively seeking to expand westward. If Virginia had their way, Virginia would have stretched from the Atlantic all the way to the Pacific. There were actual border fights, over bends in the river, with one side basically saying that no, the bend in the river does not demarcate our border. So, again, following the British concession of independence to the colonies in the Treaty of Paris in 1783, a couple of important events demonstrated the weakness of the Articles and increased the frustration on the part of American political leaders. They had grave difficulty conducting foreign affairs. For example, John Adams was designated by the Continental Congress as Foreign Minister for England, but the British refused to meet with him. preferring to negotiate with each of the American states separately. Again, they wanted to play that divide to rule kind of game. Several state governments were taken over by radical interests. Following the revolution, royalist colonial elites who controlled lands designated to the crown were stripped of their privileges, which in a couple of states, including Pennsylvania and Rhode Island, led to elections of radicals in the government, which were factions representing farmers and people living on the frontier. And the policies of those states, which frequently included printing paper money to discharge debts, appalled political elites in other states, to the point where in some states, Rhode Island's currency was simply not accepted at all. Okay. One event that profoundly affected American political leaders was Shays' Rebellion. Massachusetts policies in the years after the war enraged small farmers. In particular, Massachusetts raised taxes and then basically said, we're going to pass a law. All taxes all back debts have to be paid, and they have to be paid immediately and in gold. Well, farmers lacked the resources. They lacked gold. And they were oftentimes very poor between harvests. And so quite often that meant, and a lot of the farmers viewed those policies as coastal elites trying to take their land, because that was going to be the practical effect of these policies. And so that led to a farmers' insurrection led by Daniel Shays. Now, Shays had served in the Continental Army and had been breveted, had been promoted to non-commissioned officer as a result. And he began marching on some of the major, townships. And basically you'd have 1,500, people with muskets walking into town, walking into banks, and basically at gunpoint pulling out all the mortgages that farmers owed and then taking them into the town square and burning them. This was considered a terrible affront by the elected people of the government of Massachusetts. They tried to call out the Massachusetts militia, but they discovered that most of the people in the militia were basically had taken sides with Daniel Shays. So they were compelled to hire a mercenary army that was led by a former colonial general. Was comprised mostly of Virginia militia. They very quickly came up to Massachusetts. They caught Daniel Shays and their band while they were trying to seize an armory so that they could better arm the kind of rabble that they had surrounding them. The militia fired a couple of volleys into the mob and basically drove them off. Daniel Shays fled the state. I think he ended up dying in Rhode Island about 10 or 12 years later. They hung one or two of the insurrection's leaders, and then they basically said, okay, that's enough. They didn't try to seek out and arrest every one of the, probably more than 1,000 people who had served, who had been part of the insurrection. So the difficulties in putting down the insurrection really disturbed a lot of the leaders in the in America, and it led to George Washington issuing sort of a state of concern. Washington was approached by that time he was retired to Mount Vernon. He was approached by members of the Continental Congress, including Alexander Hamilton, who had been one of his aides to camp, and James Madison. And they asked him to lend his voice to calls for government reform. And again, in this period, members of the Continental Congress called what would later be called the Annapolis Convention. And the purpose of the Annapolis Convention was originally focused on economic development, but the political problems with the Articles of Confederation were viewed as so clear and so likely to continue to impede economic growth that they led to calls for a constitutional convention. which was subsequently approved by the Continental Congress with the mission of amending and reforming the existing government. So the Constitutional Convention met in Philadelphia in the summer of 1786. It was an environment ripe for reform. You ended up getting a number of proposals. James Madison came to the convention with a call for a completely different government. It would have looked a lot like the English government. There would have been something like a lower house. There would have been like the House of Commons. There would have been an upper chamber of sort of landed elites. And then there would have been something like a cabinet government. Very quickly, rival people from other states that disagreed with Madison proposed an alternative plan. Madison's plan was described as the Virginia plan. Subsequently, you had an alternative plan which became known as the New Jersey plan, and that would have effectively simply strengthened the Articles of Confederation. They argued quite a bit about the respective qualities of the two plans, and over time, you got what became known as the Connecticut Compromise, which today we understand as the Great Compromise, and that was we're going to create a bicameral legislature. Okay. The Great Compromise, again, took elements of the Virginia plan and the New Jersey plan. It had a lower house where the election was held by population, and then it had an upper house where each state would be guaranteed of 2 representatives. Okay? So let's stop for a second and talk a little bit about the delegates to the Constitution and just, how representative were they? Okay, so when you look at the question of race, among the 13 colonies, 80% of the colonies were, the colonists were considered to be white. 2% were other free people, and then 18%. So keep in mind, almost 1/5 of the population at that time were effectively slaves. Okay, the 1790 consensus declined to count Native American peoples unless they were living within white communities and owned property. So despite there being many Native Americans living in communities, especially in the southern states, especially in Georgia and South Carolina, they were not really counted within the census because they were not viewed as ripe for citizenship, if you will. So the Constitutional Convention's delegates were 100% white males, really. I mean, you have to keep in mind, we'll talk about this again in a second, right? So by race, there was no other representation. There were no Native Americans. There were no blacks. In terms of slave owners, 83% of the population were non-slave owners, and only about 17% owned slaves. And really, of that body, a much smaller number owned a considerable number of slaves, okay? There were many slave owners where basically they might only own 1 or 2 slaves, okay? But there were a small number of slave owners that owned upwards of thousands of slaves that managed very large plantations of hundreds of thousands of acres. So they were only, slave owners were only about 17% of the population. And yet they were over 1/3 of the population of the delegates. Okay, so slave owners were overrepresented at the Constitutional Convention. And then again, when you look at gender, like today, it was almost a 50-50 split between men and women, and yet again, 100%. There was not a single woman at the Constitutional Convention. The Constitution deals with the issue of slavery in a number of ways. Despite the lucrative nature of slavery, its morality was challenged. The religious revivals of the late 18th century condemned slavery as morally indefensible. Eventually, the conflict over slavery led to a split within the Baptist Church in 1845. Southern Baptists became Southern Baptists over the issue of slavery. At the time of independence, the growing hostility to slavery in the North produced very defensive attitudes in the South. Nevertheless, the enslaved found ways of resisting. There were numerous slave revolts in the southern colonies prior to independence, and southern states were highly militarized. If you were a white male in the South from a wealthy family, you were expected to train in horsemanship and weaponry. There were highly militarized slave patrols and well-armed militias prepared to react quickly to word of an uprising on any of the large plantations where slaves were kept in large numbers. But slaves nevertheless engaged oftentimes in what American political anthropologist James C. Scott described as everyday resistance. Engaging in work slowdowns, pretending to be dumb. I don't know what you're talking. What are you saying? They would oftentimes engage in minor acts of sabotage and sometimes major acts of sabotage. Grain silos would go up in flames. Haystacks would go up, and so again, it was not. Slaves were not quiescent at any point in this period. So it's important also to keep in mind that in the recent past, in colonial time, at the time of the Constitutional Convention, blacks were acknowledged as having played a significant role in the Continental Army, which challenged a number of the commonly held biases against blacks. Between 5,000 and 8,000 blacks served in the Continental Army during the Revolutionary War, many with distinction. So again, as a result of their service, most northern states abolished slavery following the Revolutionary War. So one of the main things that emerged out of the Constitution was this idea of the 3/5 compromise. Southern states demanded reassurances that the institution of slavery would not be affected by the new government. So 90% of slaves resided in 5 southern states. Those states were Georgia, Maryland, North Carolina, South Carolina, and Virginia. In fact, most of the slaves were concentrated on large plantations in a belt that runs from roughly the center of Virginia in a curve through the Carolinas, Georgia, Alabama, and Mississippi, which is today, even today is known as the Black Belt, where for 2 reasons. One, the soil was particularly favorable for cultivation, but also where there was very large concentrations of slaves. Today, of course, you still have large concentrations of blacks that live in those areas that we call the Black Belt. So conflict over how slaves should be counted for purposes of representation created real divisions within the convention delegates. The Southern delegates, led by the Pinckney, they weren't brothers, Charles and I can't remember what the other Pinckney was named, but the Pinckneys basically said, look, if we don't get some reassurances that we will not, that we can stop anybody attacking slavery, we're going to blow up the convention. And so eventually they came to this idea of the 3/5 compromise, okay? And so the 3/5 compromise was a political expedient that granted slaveholding states more representation than they deserved in the House of Representatives. Southern states gained 14 states in the original Congress, which was about 13% more representation than they would have had if slaves had not been counted at all. You also had questions about extension of the slave trade. And of course, the slave trade was this idea, again, European, predominantly after the Revolutionary War. I think England was out of the slave trade. And they actually were trying to prevent the transmission of slaves from the Revolutionary War period well into the 19th century. But the Portuguese were still aggressively involved, and there were some American merchants that got involved in transporting slaves too. And so that was known as the Middle Passage. Where you would go to West Africa or East Africa, wherever there were large slave markets, purchase large numbers of slaves, pack them onto ships, and then ship them, over to, either to Brazil, which was also a slave-holding state where slavery was legal, or into southern ports. So again, merchants specializing in the shipping of human slaves traveled to the coast of African slave markets. They would pack the slaves so tightly that half of them would die on the passage to the harbors of, again, the slave importing states, to Savannah, to Norfolk, and to to Charleston. The slave states basically resisted calls for a ban on federal regulation of the slave trade at the convention. 10 of the 13 colonies, again, had outlawed the importation of slaves by 1787. So the delegates from the three remaining importing states, again, threatened to walk out of the convention. And again, the compromise can be found in Article 1, Section 9. That preserved the authority of the slave importing states to continue the trade for another 20 years or until 1808, and did allow a tax on the importation of slaves up to $10 per slave. So this again was sort of an odious compromise where they were basically creating this idea that they were going to allow the slave trade to persist, and they would allow taxation on the slaves in return. And what the southern states were basically saying was, we need to be able to build up our stock of slaves in order to get to a point where we would have enough domestically that we could continue with the institution. So, question and answer. Was taxation the main issue that caused the colonists to seek independence, or were there other issues that antagonized Americans? The answer is, yeah, there were a number of other issues, and one of them, and it kind of emerged from the French and Indian Wars. The British spent a great deal of time, and the French and Indian Wars, if you don't know, there was a great deal of kind of what we might call guerrilla warfare today that took place, where the British were the French were perfectly willing to contract with Native American tribes to raid colonial lands. And that meant that the British had to figure out ways to defend oftentimes lightly populated colonial territories. And so the British found that to be enormously expensive, where, again, on the one hand, you had to station troops in areas that, again, were very lightly populated, but nevertheless, if you didn't defend them, they'd get burned to the ground. And that would kind of, again, you'd be losing territory. And so building palisades, you had to chop down, lots and lots of trees. You had to build, these rural forts. In fact, George Washington found himself drawn into those conflicts during the French and Indian Wars. That's where he got a lot of his military experience. He also did some training with the British prior to that even. And so the British understood, first and foremost, because again, once they won the French and Indian Wars, they got a lot of French possessions. And, they basically ended up controlling what is today Canada as a result of the French and Indian Wars. And the one thing that they understood was that there were some very, very large Native American tribes in the Ohio Valley, which was just beyond the ridge of mountains that demarcated the 13 colonies, particularly in the north and the Atlantic coastal states. And so they understood, in the aftermath of the French and Indian Wars, that the colonists' urge to westward expansion was going to draw them into what the British feared would be very significant conflicts, between the colonies and those Native American tribes. And importantly, a lot of that land still was claimed by the French. Remember about the Louisiana Purchase. And so the British basically, one of the main things they did was to basically say, you will not expand westward. Well, again, that was deeply embedded in the ideology of the colonists at that time, that they were destined to go westward. And so they bridled at it. And again, especially that activated a lot of the frontier people. Because for them, westward expansion was the main vehicle for wealth. Okay, when you think about it, one of the main ways that George Washington became one of the wealthiest people in the colonies was that in the aftermath of the French and Indian Wars, the British basically said you can claim all the land that you can survey. And of course, Washington was very adept at surveying. Well, he ended up surveying a big part of the Shenandoah Valley, and that's how he became one of the wealthiest people in the colonies. The other way was that he married Martha Custis, who was one of the wealthiest widows in the colonies. And so, again, land was widely understood as one of those major sources of wealth. And so the colonists basically viewed the British ban on the movement from to the west as shackling them economically. So when you combine that with the tax policies, you can understand why the colonies viewed what the British were doing, what British policies were doing, as increasingly tyrannical and coercive. Okay, and again, given the long nature of colonial, autonomy, if not in outright independence, that was simply not acceptable to many of the colonists. I've oftentimes had students say, they're arguing over taxes. I mean, come on, it's just taxes. But, to this day, we are a nation, that was born out of a tax revolt, if you will. And so, we shouldn't be all that surprised that people are easily antagonized by taxes. Here's another colony question and answer here. The colonies had no navy to speak of. How were they able to defeat the British, which at the time was one of the world's preeminent military superpowers? And that's an interesting question. And again, the reason that the British ultimately lost has to do with a military concept called the tyranny of distance. The British, on the one hand, had to project their forces from Europe into the colonies. First and foremost, the colonies represented an enormous amount of territory to the European military mind. Okay, British and European military figures generally looked at the confined area of Europe as sort of the theaters of action. And so the way warfare worked at that time, you had very small professional armies, with highly trained people, and your job was not necessarily to eradicate the the other, the other country's military, but rather to compel their surrender. That if you could compel the surrender of one of a country's major armies, that they would capitulate, right? That you would, that the cost of paroling all those people and guaranteeing that they would not serve for the duration of the war, that would fatally hamstring one country's war effort. Well, the colonists didn't fight according to the European rules of war. The colonists basically, remember, the Revolutionary War began with the battles of Lexington and Concord, which resulted in the British being penned in to Boston. Okay, and then you saw just this, every colonial militia person, everybody that had a gun ended up, suddenly there were 8,000 men ringing in Boston. And so the British were penned in Boston, but they were a much more efficient, much better trained fighting force. They broke the siege of Boston. Well, so the colonists retreated to New York. They drove the Continental Army, that was at that time still just a rabble, that by that time was led by George Washington, drove them out of New York, and they fled to Philadelphia. In European warfare, anybody would have, any other country would have surrendered by that point. Its army would have been demonstrated to be ineffective to protect its cities, and so they would have just said, okay, we give up. Well, the colonists didn't do that. And in fact, the British then drove them out of Philadelphia. And what did the colonists do? They retreated into western, or more like central, Virginia, or central Pennsylvania, and set up winter camp in Valley Forge. And the British thought they'd won, and they spent the British officers, spent their time wining and dining in Philadelphia and enjoying Philadelphia society, while the Americans trained and learned how to become an army. And out of the crucible of that winter in Valley Forge, George Washington, with the help of some European trainers, was able to create the Continental Army and forge them into a formidable fighting force. So the Continental Army, a big part of it is, again, this idea of the tyranny of distance. Every time you conquer a city, you then have to garrison it. And that began to stretch British lines of supply, which Washington was able to attack in detail, which means you're able to use a larger force to attack a smaller force. And additionally, the British felt like they needed to go and do something to demonstrate their dominance. So they began changing the theater, the nature of the warfare. And you had Lord Cornwallis go to the south, thinking that he could defeat the local areas there, and then he would have an easier time defeating Washington's army, having kind of wrapped up the South, if you will. But ultimately, the problem that he confronted was that even in the South, the fighting began to get kind of difficult, and ultimately, he found himself trapped in Yorktown, in Virginia. He was trying to march to join up with other British forces, and Washington was able to trap him on the coastal town of Yorktown. Well, guess what? Yorktown is a coastal area. The British Navy could easily have relieved the beleaguered troops in Yorktown, but instead the French actually sent a naval squadron to America and defeated the British forces there, and ultimately compelled Cornwallis to surrender. So the British ultimately surrendered because they were following the European rules of warfare. With Cornwallis's surrender, they lacked the troops to continue. They basically, part of the parole was they had to send those surrendered troops back to England, and they couldn't replace them for a period of time. That left them with insufficient troops to actually continue to prosecute the war. And so as a result, the British ended up suing for peace. Now, there were political reasons, too, for why the British ultimately gave up on the colonies. First and foremost, there was growing domestic unrest over the conduct of the war. There were many British that sympathized with the colonial cause. There were a number of British that had economic interests in the colonies that were determined to hold on to them. But there were many others that basically were Enlightenment figures. People like Edmund Burke was sympathetic to the colonial cause. He was an Irish member of the Parliament. He was really English, but he represented an Irish district. And basically, again, they felt like this was a poor investment of English blood and treasure. And then there was also the reality that the French were still and remained a significant threat to the British mainland, to the British Isles. And again, with the loss of that fleet, with that defeat, and having to go and refit those ships and defend their Caribbean possessions, because the French were becoming more and more active, and there was rising piracy in the Caribbean islands. The British again felt that they had to basically give up on holding on to their North American possessions. And the consequence, again, of the end of the war was that a lot of the American colonists who had supported continued British rule left. Okay, there were a lot of sort of well-to-do coastal Americans who were they remained British. They never felt like it was that important to them. They never felt like independence was that meaningful. And so when when the die was cast and the British surrendered, you had a number of those folks move to Canada as a result. Okay, so again. At some level, the point was not that the British were the most powerful in the world. It was more that the American colonies were able to demonstrate to the British that they were simply not prepared to be governed any longer. And that continues to be one of the main ways that you see political change. Okay. When you think recently about the American experience in Afghanistan, a significant part of it, again, the American military is the preeminent military in the world. We could defeat the Afghanistan, the people, the Taliban, and whoever else wanted to fight us in Afghanistan. But we could not govern them. We could not rule them. In the face of, constant insurrections and attacks. That's a very simple reality. The only way to have defeated to basically defeat Afghanistan, and this is something the Russians discovered too, and the Russians were far more ruthless in prosecuting their occupation of Afghanistan than the United States was. They basically killed with impunity. I think they killed over 1 million Afghanis, and I'm not sure how many we killed, ultimately. But again, the point is, if the only way to hold on to a territory is to kill everyone in it, you have to question the morality of pursuing that kind of just long-standing, attack. Another question, did Southern slaveholders support independence from the British? This is a really tricky question, again, because especially if you're a large slaveholder, what are you going to be able to do? Do you take your slaves somewhere else and risk having them run away? In many instances, the larger plantation holders swore obeisance to the British. They basically said, we're just gonna go along, with British occupation of southern states. But in many instances, their children did not. The Pinckneys, for example, both served in the Revolutionary War. And so Pierce Butler, who was, another main, he was a delegate to the Constitution, also served as an officer in the Continental Congress. And so, it's important to keep in mind that slavery was, basically held people in place. But again, a lot of even the slaveholders were favorable to independence. Okay, but I think it was a minority, frankly, of the larger slaveholders that were actively and zealously fighting for independence. Many of them were sort of nominally saying, we're out of this. Okay, and in some instances, they may have surreptitiously aided, the colonists in the fight. So here's a last question. That is, how did the slave states use federalism to prevent the escape of slaves to northern states, where most people were opposed to slavery? And again, this was part of the wrangling that took place between the delegates from the northern and the southern states over the course of the Constitutional Convention. At several points, southern delegates basically said, we want a return clause. We want a rendition clause for all escaped slaves. And again, this is a recognition that at the time, it wasn't like a lot of apologists for slavery were saying that the slaves were well treated almost uniformly, and they were all happy with what they were with their lot in life. Slaves routinely tried to escape. They tried to escape with their wives and their children. And this was a major source of kind of economic loss for southern plantation holders. And so at various points they tried to institute these kinds of clauses, and ultimately they were successful in getting what would become known as Article 4 of the Constitution, which we'll talk more about in the next presentation, the Fugitives from Labor Clause. And it was Article 4. And it basically said, no person held to service or labor in one state under the laws thereof, escaping into another, shall in consequence of any law or regulation therein be discharged from such service or labor, but shall be delivered up on the claim of the party to whom such services and labor may be due. In legalese, what they're basically saying is that slaves that escape are still slaves, and that states that where slaves escape to have no legal basis for freeing them, but instead have a legal obligation to return them. Now, this clause, again, it essentially required northern states to return escaped slaves. But northern state governments were often reluctant to assist in the return of slaves, and some openly defied the constitutional requirement because slavery was deeply unpopular in those states. Remember what I was talking about, the religious revivals. In the years following the Constitutional Convention, those revivals they intensified, and in several states you had, what do they call it, the Great Awakening. Well, one of the key elements of the Great Awakening was, sort of this profound opposition to the institution of slavery. And so, let's be clear about this. Slaves, the lawyers of slave owners were legally in their, within their rights to go to northern states and say, you have a person who is an escaped slave, and we want that person returned. We want to use the assistance of state and local law enforcement to catch those people and to bring them back to their state of servitude. But in many northern states, not all of them, because again, in some southern, in some states, especially as you get new states coming in, Ohio and some other states, that were frontier states, those folks basically had, they had economic interests in this, in slavery. Okay, but in some other states, again, where a majority of people that were electing state and local officials, where those folks were convinced of the immorality and the unacceptability of slavery, in those states, those folks routinely looked the other way. And when Southern lawyers and Southern agents approached, state officials, they would basically say, I'm under no obligation to help you. I'm not going to help you. That so antagonized the South in the years prior to the Civil War that they actually got through Congress, again, because of the fact that the South held more representation in the Congress. The Fugitive Slave Act, which again was designed to compel states and local officials to assist Southern agents in the return of slaves. Nevertheless, that became, again, an ongoing point of contention where people simply didn't want to do something that was profoundly unpopular. And you're kind of seeing that here today, prior to the Dobbs versus Jackson Women's Health decision that basically overturned Roe versus Wade. The state of Texas passed a law that basically banned abortion and basically enabled anyone, any citizen, from filing civil suit against anyone on having information that a person facilitated the travel of a pregnant woman out of state to procure an abortion. A lot of people think that there are very strong parallels between, the fugitive slave law and that. And of course, a lot of people that are anti-abortion, think in terms of slavery with they basically identify with the rights of unborn children and view the termination of pregnancies as deeply immoral. Whereas, again, likewise, you also have a lot of people advocating for women's reproductive rights that think that forcing women to carry a pregnancy to term violates the 13th Amendment's ban on involuntary servitude. So this is where our politics, is today, and this presentation sort of sets out how our politics was in the late 18th century and the factors that led to the War of Independence and subsequently the first founding and ultimately the second founding. So our Constitution was born out of a series of compromises, many of which people profoundly disagree with. But nevertheless, they represent, sort of the practical political challenges that had to be confronted and the compromises that had to be met, that had to be forged in order for the country to create a regime that could compel sufficient acceptance that it would have the authority and the legitimacy to govern. So that's where we are for today. When we come back, we're going to continue our discussion of the Constitution, the founding, and the challenges, the different principles that form our Constitution today. I'll see you next time.